So how many of you have been in AI for more than 5 years? 10? 15? No? College, yeah. And it's been around for a long time. Before people called it AI, there was speech recognition and machine translation and things like that that are now considered AI, before it was called AI. And if you've been in the business for a while, you've probably realized that business executives and data scientists and technical stakeholders, they all have different languages and cultures. In my very first job way back when in Vienna, I was an interpreter, actually working in the people in the booth that listen and talk at the same time, which is a pretty crazy profession. And I still have the same job now. Now just I translate between business executives and data scientists, and they still speak very different languages and cultures. And what I've found is that having a good way to get them all on the same page is extremely helpful to avoid downstream problems, unhappiness with business outcomes, and misunderstandings in general. So today I wanted to talk to you about why AI is like making the perfect slice of toast, which admittedly is a little bit of a clickbaity title, but it will make sense, I promise. So the reason why I wanted to anchor all of this on the metaphor of a toaster is that if you think of a model, an AI model, and the model output, and in this case, the model output is the slice of toast, it has a much bigger context. And just like toasters are actually designed to toast for a tiny fraction of the day, right? A few minutes a day, maybe 5 minutes, that leaves 1,435 minutes where the toaster is not toasting. So if you were to design a perfect toaster, obviously it should work. It should do what it's supposed to do and brown a piece of toast, but its predominant function is really to look good. It's just sitting there, right? So the design of the toaster is a key value prop, and it's a key design consideration because design is about function, but also about fitting in, right? About the integration of the toaster into the kitchen. So if you wanted to sell toasters like Smeg, which is a very upscale, high-end toaster brand, and you want to charge a good amount of money for it, it has to look great. Because it is predominant function of the toaster is to look good while it's just sitting there. So what does that have to do with AI? If you think about the model output, let's say a stock recommendation to a wealth advisor, that is, of course, important to get right. But what is the bigger context of that stock recommendation? The bigger context of how the model is running in the wealth advisor's dashboard, let's say, or what data is feeding it. And if you think of the toaster as the electricity under the covers and the coils that actually do the heat and the chassis and the fobs and the buttons, all of that has to work together to produce the model output. But your vision for the overall deployment and implementation has to take into account not just the model accuracy or the model end result, right? It has to take into account the user, let's say in this case the wealth advisor, the context, where will this advice be delivered? What is the cognitive load of the wealth advisor? What is the context of that wealth advisor's profession? I've seen, having done AI for a long time, I've seen perfectly well thought out solutions fail because it did not take into account the context of the consumption of the model output. Because, for example, the wealth advisor might feel threatened by this output. So they're incented not to like it. In the days of speech recognition, contact center agents sometimes felt threatened by the speech technology, the speech recognition technology, and hence wanted it to fail, or the screen pop, or other things like that. So taking into account a much bigger vision that the end user in context of their needs, not just the functional needs of the model accuracy and performance, but also their cognitive needs, their psychological needs, their security needs, and so on and so forth, is the idea of the toaster paradox that don't just design it for doing a good job at the task of making toast, design it for the holistic vision of where it's going to live, right, of how it's going to ultimately deliver value, and design it also for all the stakeholders. You may have had discussions, if you're technical, if you have built models, you may have had discussions with people and said, oh, the model accuracy, ROC, is 98.9%. It's 2% better than the other model that we have. And then you get blank stares because what's ROC and model performance and accuracy and things like that, those metrics don't make a ton of sense to business stakeholders. So that need of the business stakeholder to also understand, to support and fund the model deployment, the AI solution, is key to take into account, again, when you're planning for a holistic vision. When I say framing and imperatives, those are two steps in the innovation cycle that are often overlooked by highly technical people. And you can think of it like this. If you look at just the problem and you design a solution, you're doing the thing that many technical people do, which is, oh, here's the problem, here's the button that fixes it. Framing and imperatives is taking a step back and saying, well, let's frame the problem in a bigger context. And a master at doing this is Apple. Apple is genius at framing and deriving the correct imperatives. Let me give you an example. Do you remember the first iPod many, many moons ago, 2004, I believe it was? Before the iPhone even, right? Do you remember the ad for the iPod, what that looked like? It was just a silhouette of a person with a white headset. That was it. Crazy that it worked, right? People standing around the block waiting for the iPod. Now, you might want to ask yourself, why was that headset white? Is that a good color for a headset? Terrible. It's like the worst color for a headset. It gets dirty, it gets grimy, it shows all kinds of nastiness on it. Why did they make it white? Not because they were just looking at a problem and making a solution, which would have been a black headset, but they framed it properly. They framed the whole context of the Apple consumption experience properly. And at the time, and still today, Apple is not just electronics or features, specs, speeds and feeds, performance. It's also a status symbol, right? I'm an early adopter, I'm hip, I'm desirable, I'm attractive, I have an Apple product, right? That's why people stand around the block, and they never did for the Zune, which was the Microsoft player, which just on a technical level had better performance, more expandability, slots, more file support. You could bring your own music in an easy way, all of that stuff. But the Zune fizzled, the iPod succeeded. So they said, well, the iPod is really small. So if the true framing of this device is not just play music, but signal, how do I best do that when it's in my pocket with a white headset? This is why, to this day, Apple headsets are white. And now many people have cloned this, but at the time, it was absolutely genius because you could walk down the street with this tiny little iPod in your pocket and still do all the signaling that you wanted to do about having an Apple product with you and in your pocket. So framing and imperatives, meaning the framing is I want to have accurate model performance, but I also want to take into account the consumption, the cognitive load of the person doing the consuming, what's their context in the contact center, or while they're having a client conversation, all of that. Now I can derive an imperative that says, make a white headset, make it stand out. And then I can advertise that in the case of Apple. In the case of an AI machine learning product, I can think about how the model output will actually be produced, what it will look like. Many machine learning and AI products fail because it takes a long time, right? It takes a good while in a bank of any size or any financial services institution. Actually, in most companies, it can take you 3 to 6 months at least to go from idea to finished product, right? Sometimes longer. 9 to 12 months, not unusual for large first-of-a-kind models. And again, keeping in mind the framing and imperatives of all the consumers of the model output and the sponsors will then let you think about how can I signal, how can I produce value for those folks while I'm still making the algorithm. And by the way, algorithms don't demo well. If you've ever showed a Jupyter notebook to somebody who's not technical, you'll probably have experienced this. You think it's great, and then they just look at it blankly and go like, that's all just gobbledygook to me. So back to the toaster design or the iPod, the white headset, what is that? What is the corollary of that in machine learning for you? I found, for example, very successful. I'll make little infographic-style videos that are 90 seconds long that tell the value proposition of the AI machine learning project, so it's easily consumable by people who are not technical, and they can forward it. So it's part of my communication strategy that is part of the holistic vision, that I take into account a great set of different stakeholder needs, and I try to cater to them beyond just ROC, beyond just the technical. It has to be fast and performant and do all of that stuff, but it also has to live in a context that's much, much bigger. So that's the first V. There will be 3 Vs, the vision of a holistic vision that lets you derive correct imperatives and framing, and that lets you then correctly position and design the solution for its much broader context. Later, I'll give you a simple question that I've used for years and have not yet had anybody give me a complete answer to, ever. And it will give you a summary form to probe on all 3 Vs with stakeholders across your organization, and it will give them a simple context for you to frame and for them to frame the overall AI journey in. So don't walk out just yet. Some big stuff coming later. But think of the toaster paradox. Thinking of the toaster paradox, I found is a very useful way of thinking that, you know, you also, in an AI project, you see a very tiny sliver of how it all works, but you also don't care, right? Do you care? Most people don't want to see the electricity. They want to see the work product of it, right? Because if you see electricity, something went terribly wrong in your house, if sparks are flying, right? You just want to see the brown slice of toast. You don't actually care how it works, by and large, where the power comes from. And most people don't care how your model works, the corollary of the electricity, right? How the data powers it, what's all happening under the shiny cover of the toaster. So you'll be successful or more successful if you design a good toaster, a holistic solution that's properly designed, positioned, and framed. However, things fall apart if the funding dries up. People like to say agile, and agile is really hard to do in AI because sometimes it takes you 3, 4, or 5 months just to do the data wrangling and getting the right data permissions, and then somebody in a smoke-filled room or locked room with pizza thrown in every once in a while is writing things in Jupyter or in Data Robot or other tools. And it takes a really long time to show something, right? And I mentioned to you the infographic-style video is a good way to keep excitement and communication and kind of information flowing while things happen that are very difficult to demo. But you need to think about the validation not only in the stages of building, but of course when it goes live. How do you make sure that your promises of business success, your business outcomes, are actually true? You'll get away with it once if they are not, and then never again. So it's generally a best practice to think about instrumentation, tracking, and KPIs from day -1. So, for example, I build a machine learning product that listens to callers and in a call center, and it pops up a screen pop based on what the caller is saying, right? So that the agent doesn't have to click around. And the promise is that it will make calls shorter with higher net promoter score and bigger first call resolution. That is my KPI set for this call center solution. Okay, good. Now, have you thought about where the hooks go? How do you measure that, right? How do you know that that's actually true? Have you built a testing plan that has sufficient statistical power to actually prove that as the model goes live, as it gets tuned, that these calls that have the software support or the machine learning support actually do get shorter, and that the NPS is higher, and that the repeat call rate goes down? So tracking your KPIs and putting the right hooks into the system, super critical. It's important to think about the validation also when you design top-down business cases. So for example, I'm going to use a next best offer model in this market, and I expect a 2% lift in wealth sales, let's say. So how do you prove marketing spend? How do you prove marketing optimization through machine learning? Very difficult, right? There's an old chestnut that says, the CMO says, I'm wasting half of my dollars, I just don't know which half. And we don't want that, right? We want quantifiability. So if you were to use an AI system in a particular market, you want to think about designing well-designed proofs that are statistically have sufficient power that says, because of A/B testing, I now know that this has indeed worked, that this ML solution, this next best offer solution, has indeed produced a lift of X%, right? So the validation is critical from a mechanical point of view, the statistical, mathematical, and mechanical point of view. And it's also super important to have the right air support. Air support means a sufficiently senior person in the organization says, yes, that's true. This may have happened to you that you have some very enthusiastic, let's say, second AVP of call center operations or whatever, wealth. And they think it's $1 billion idea, and they're fully supportive of your machine learning model. However, the head of wealth has never heard of it. And then the CEO asks that head of wealth, saying, hey, we're spending $8 million on this machine learning solution. What do you think about it? And they go, nope, never heard of it. That's not good, right? So think about air support that has to come from sufficiently high to be effective. And if you have somebody deep down in the organization who is very enthusiastic, that's obviously a great influencer, and it's very important to have support on all levels. It's not by any means to deprecate the support and help of all ranks of the organization, but you do need that high-level support as well, which kind of comes back a little bit to the positioning. Remember the first slide? So when I want to get support from those folks, I have to phrase it and I have to think about different aspects of my solution and phrase it, of course, differently than if I speak to somebody who is the actual implementer. So air support and advocacy are absolutely critical. And at the end of the day, no dollars, no cents, right? It won't stay at the table. So the quantifiability of your results, the dollar business case, is super key. There are two basic forms of business cases. I'm a huge fan of the bottoms-up business case for AI. Bottoms-up means P times Q. I'm going to make 10,000 calls, 2 minutes shorter. A call minute is $1, $20,000 of benefits. Very simple. Fits on the back of an envelope. I'm extremely leery of business cases that have like 20-tabbed spreadsheets. You know, the super detailed and everything's variabilized, and I'm like, and you can't know any of these things really with any kind of, so you just have added more detail but not more accuracy. So I'm a big fan of saying, keep it short, back of an envelope, and bottoms up is preferred in my mind because it's usually easier to instrument, because remember you have to show the KPIs and the tracking and the validation, and you have to make sure that you can actually have what I call a chain of custody of value. That means there aren't any big air gaps in where, oh, I produced a report, and then hopefully these people looked at it and hopefully acted on it, and that resulted in more door swings, but I can't prove it. So you have, in that case, you have no chain of custody of value unless you have designed some other way of A/B testing to kind of bridge that air gap, right? In marketing, one of the famously difficult problems is I launched a campaign and have door swings. Are those two related? And it's difficult to prove, which is why CMOs have a short tenure often. So if you have a good instrumented, provable chain of custody of value that's P times Q and easy to explain, that also links back up, you'll see that all of these puzzle pieces actually tie together. It links back up with the valuation and also the vision, because it's easy to communicate that simple business case. If I talk to the CEO, which I'll actually do next week, about some AI stuff, my hook and my value proposition has to be super polished and has to be very accessible, very credible, and in plain English. And there's no word, the gradient descent does not occur in that sentence, right? Or deep learning even, or neural nets, or none of that, right? Because it's irrelevant. What matters is that I say, we'll be able to increase, we'll have callers come in, we'll know why they're calling, and we'll be able to handle them, give them to the right teammate to handle their call, and they won't need to call back. And we think that's going to be about 10,000 calls a day that will benefit. That makes sense, right? I didn't have to use any of the big words. You can build top-down business cases, but then you have to have very rigorous A/B testing already planned out for that. Top-down business cases are, we'll increase share of wallet by 3%, we'll boost market share in this market by X%, et cetera. That is a very high bar to prove, because now you're doing basically marketing proofs, right? Market growth proofs. Those are very, very difficult. And I would probe very deeply on the rigor of the mathematics, of the statistical power of the proof that you have laid out to make sure that that's all true. Dollarizing everything, including risk. So that's the other thing. If you're not sure how much it's worth in dollars, then it's not going to live long, by and large. And if you look at funding cycles in a modern corporation, there used to be, of course, people have annual budgets and they allocate certain amounts of money. But if you have project funding, interest and dollars tend to dry up after 6 to 9 months. And this may have happened to you where you have a project that has huge support. October comes, everybody has to give budget back, and suddenly your project disappears, right? Because we needed to give backs. So not saying that at Truist, but it's happened to me in some of the other companies I've worked for. So I wouldn't like count on a long runway, and certainly don't count on a long runway when dollars cannot be shown to fall out at a certain point. Now, in banking, in insurance, in most of FSS, risk is a big deal, right? And reducing risk is usually a top priority for the organization. Now, how do you dollarize risk reduction? Because many machine learning models will say, we're reducing risk of fines or regulatory action or a big breach or cyber or whatever. How do you dollarize that? And it is possible, and it typically is done using scenario-based modeling. So whenever somebody comes with a, let's say, big fine avoidance or fine reduction, or this will satisfy this regulatory requirement and reduce that risk, I'll ask them to put it in form of a scenario, because then you can dollarize it. And without dollarization, you also cannot compare what you should do first. That's the other reason why you I think, must have a dollar tally for each project. Because in most organizations, there is not infinite capacity to do AI. And so you have to prioritize. And sometimes it's simply you have to do it because the regulator told you. And sometimes you have to do it because it's the pet project of some senior exec. But very, very often, you do prioritize based on impact. So how do you then do the scenario-based analysis? Let's say at a previous employer, we have a risk of a fine occurring once every 10 years. That fine is $100 million. So the annual risk is $10 million. And my AI solution reduces the risk by 50%. So the value of the AI solution is $5 million a year. If you have the right AI support from the senior risk officer, remember the appropriate level, and they say that's true, now you can put the placeholder and say, well, this is a $5 million opportunity compared to the next best offer model, which is, let's say, a $10 million or a $2 million opportunity, depending. But it gives you a common baseline dollars, both green dollars, top line dollars, as well as cost savings, cost avoidance dollars, to compare things to each other. Very, very important. So here's a quick summary and the magical question. The magical question is, and I just used it yesterday for a report. It was very unpopular to ask that question, because somebody wants me to do a report once a month. So I asked the same question of internal processes as well as projects. Whose life is going to get better? By how much? And how do you know that? Again, I've not yet had anybody answer that fully and accurately. Because it means that you have thought about the framing and imperatives. Whose life is going to get better, right? You've thought about the wealth agent. You've done the design thinking, the full design thinking loop for all the stakeholders in the project. Very, very few people do that are not trained in design thinking. So their life is going to get better because they can give a more accurate, let's say, back to the wealth advisor example, because they can give a more accurate stock tip or portfolio analysis to their customer, which will make them feel good, because that's their job satisfaction. They will welcome that input from the machine, not feel threatened by it. And it will help them hold on to their customer, grow the portfolio, get referral business, grow their overall account. Okay, I get it. That person's life is going to get better, as well as our shareholders and so on. By how much? That means you have thought about the instrumentation of the model. You have good hooks in the system. You have designed sufficiently statistically powerful models to give a satisfying answer to the dollar amount. And how do you know that? Because somebody very senior told you that that's true and is on board, right? So they agree with your way of measuring, and they will stand up for the benefit, because budget ownership, right? At some point, if you say you have a growth play, you say you will grow the top line by $5 million, well, somebody very senior is going to have to sign up for that. If you take cost out in the form of cost avoidance, the second most popular rubric of benefits, right? So if I have cost avoidance, meaning my budget doesn't actually get smaller, but I'll have more dollars. My ask for next year's budget will stay flat, but I will be able to do more things with it. That's also very popular. But again, somebody has to sign up for that. That actually has that budget authority. And least popular, cost takeout. My budget gets smaller. Very, very few people like doing that. Sometimes it's necessitated by externalities, and then the cost reduction is ordained to that very senior person, and they have to find dollars, right? In that case, you can do cost takeout. But you'll have to take somebody very senior. I have a simple formula that I like to apply to see if I'm at the roughly right level of the organization. And I call it the Maslov ratio. Okay? Maslov pyramid of needs, survival being the topmost, or the bottom, the foundation of everything. And the way it works is you simply take the estimated income of that person and divide it into the project volume, into the benefits volume. So if somebody who makes, let's say, $100,000 a year signs up for a $10 million savings, you're probably in the wrong place. It's extremely unlikely that they have that authority. If somebody who makes $5 million a year signs up for a $10 million savings, they very likely have that. So just look at that ratio, right? If it's really super huge, you probably haven't done all the selling yet. You haven't reached the right level of the organization that can authoritatively tell you that you know that now. Proper framing beats speeds and feeds. So speeds and feeds is an old IBM term that's about the processor performance of a mainframe and so on. It's just how technical people like to evaluate things and like to talk about things. And proper framing may be appropriate if you're talking to somebody very technical, but if it's utterly inappropriate if you're talking to a senior executive sponsor, right? So frame your conversation for the audience and think of whether you're designing the metal chassis of the toaster, the heating coil, or the button on the front, or the power plug. What is it that you're actually now talking about that matters to your audience? And think about that. So to the dismay and surprise of many data scientists, the success is about 5% is the model, and 95% is everything else. How are you going to integrate this thing? Which downstream system will consume the model output? How is it going to consume that? Is that system on its own track? For example, I've found the best way to optimize my default management or collections process. However, the downstream consuming system that actually sends letters is on an 18-month track that cannot be touched. So the output of my model cannot be consumed, so what do I really have, right? How is it going to ingest the data? Which APIs have to be exposed? What are the performance and SLAs of these machines that have to power, let's say, a fraud system? Fraud is notorious for having extremely aggressive SLAs, right? In a card swipe, you have 2 seconds for the whole thing. Is there enough money in the account? Is it fraud? Et cetera, et cetera. So if the fraud scoring system may get between 5 and 20 milliseconds to do its job. So now you have to have a machine learning model that can run and perform to that SLA. Very different if I want to score leads overnight in a batch process, right? So the design, the hardware design, the overall stack, how stuff is going to go in and out, all needs to be thought through. And then, of course, once the model goes live, wonderful, congratulations. Now the real work starts because now you have to monitor it. Is the model drifting in accuracy and bias? Has the data shifted, right? Because machine learning is trained on data. When the underlying data shifts, the performance goes down. Always does. It immediately starts drifting as soon as it goes live. If there's a big externality like COVID or some big shock like some war breaks out somewhere, that shift may occur in a few hours. And suddenly your model does not perform anymore and needs to be retrained, right? And then the ongoing evangelization and communication about the performance of the model, why it's worthwhile, why we should do another one, why we need model ops to do a challenger model, and all of those things are also going to the 95%. So I hope that this was a useful toaster for you and a well-designed one that fits into your environment as well. This question has incredible curative powers of getting people on the same page, helping them think holistically about the solution. And it works for everybody because it's just plain English. So I like using it all the time. I evangelize my team with it. I ask them to ask their stakeholders this question. And I can tell you that many times you will find out that this may have been a good idea, but doesn't actually have any dollars, or it doesn't have the right backing or the right stakeholder lineage and all of that. And you can cure all of that before you start writing the first line of code. So with that, I would like to open the floor for questions.